Hi, it is a pleasure to have been invited by the organizers of the SMME Roadshow to present a small masterclass on how to submit winning tenders. So, our company is called Tyrannus Co Advisory, and I am the lead advisor for the company. We primarily focus on training within the arena of tendering, as well as assisting bidders, small or big, with how to compile winning and compliant bids. And we also assist bidders who are aggrieved about an outcome of a specific tender per se, and that is in a nutshell what we render as a service. So essentially, when we talk about the know-how that is required for submitting compliant and winning tenders, one needs to understand that it is not what you know. That goes for everything in life. It is what you do with what you know. And tendering is seen as a monster. It is seen as too technical. It is seen as too legalese for most people. However, what we're going to endeavor in this masterclass today is to tackle the beast or unpack the legalese and dissect the technicalities within the tendering process. Because where we come from, we firmly believe that there's too much of a focus on the tender document and nobody gets educated around the tender process. So what are we seeing in front of us is that essentially Dr. Schleifler is saying that Google can't make you a cup of tea. You can search the internet as much as you want to on how to tender. I can throw many manuals at you on how to tender. But if I don't share the know-how, and it is human beings that shares know-how, if I don't show the know-how with you, I would not leave you the wiser. Essentially, what Dr. Schleifler is saying is that the world will only compensate or award tenders in another man's language to those who have applied as to what they know. So the essential focus is on not what I know, but the know-how in terms of application and compiling, the emphasis being on compiling compliant winning tenders. That is the journey that we will undertake going forward. So the key focus of this masterclass is how do we as bidders, whether I'm doing this for 10 years or whether I want to enter into the game of tendering, the biggest question for you when you seal your envelope, your bid document, you need to ask, is that a compliant bid? Now, many people will say that you need to know somebody on the inside in order to win a tender. A few years back, I did a class and I went round the table and I asked people, why are you here? One lady said, I'm here because it is true that people tells me that in order to win a tender, I need to know somebody on the inside. So I'm here today in the workshop knowing how to go about getting to know somebody on the inside. Her perspective. I go down the table and I get to a gentleman and he said, the reason why I'm here today is that to my surprise, I won a tender. And to be honest with you, I don't know how I won it. I'm here today to learn how people win tenders. Different perspective. And it is essential then, if I need to be fair and neutral and step into the middle, I would then say, okay, two different perspectives. I myself need to upskill my knowledge around the process then to submit compliant bids. Now, also, people think that winning tenders is all about price and my proposal for the product or the service to be rendered. It is not. It is about being technically and legally being compliant with your bid document. So if your bid document is not complete in nature, or your bid document is not fully compliant, then your grand price and your super product or service will be ignored because that is secondary within the overall process. Primarily, we need to look at how do I enter the game in round one. Round one asks for compliant bids. But it's also important that when we endeavor to submit compliant bids, that we then say to ourselves, what strategies can I apply to outbid, outprice, and outwit, and whatever the case may be, my competitors? Because remember, in your industry, the one thing that everybody say every day is that this industry is small. We know each other. We know each other's issues and challenges. We know each other's product quality. We know each other's prices, for that matter. Now, seeing that we're all on an equal footing with regards to those issues, you need to say, when you seal your envelope with your bid document, as to how can I strategically outwit and outbid my competitors. Now, champions knows the rules of the game, whether that is soccer, rugby, or cricket, or netball, or hockey, for that matter. Champions knows the basic rules of the game. If you do the basics well, you can then design a game plan for match day. Same applies to tendering. And then the match day for us in tendering is that endeavor or that objective to submit a compliant bid. So ultimately, where does this thing occur with regards to compliance? And the big answer to that is tender forms must be completed in a complete manner. Tender forms determines as to who would be considered for evaluation and eventually for adjudication. I'll unpack those two terms as we go along. So, when Gerrit says you must aim to submit a compliant bid because that determines who wins the game, you need then to ask Gerrit, what are the rules in order for us to submit a compliant bid, as well as what strategies can we apply to then submit a compliant bid in the first place, and secondly, how do we become the champion or the preferred or the recommended bidder for that contract which everybody is gunning for. So what are we saying? We are saying before you can enter the game of tendering, you need to understand the rules of the game. We call it the rules of ingredients. In terms of chocolate baking, when you say, I want to go into catering, we say there are 4 pillars that you need to recognize before you can get into catering. Number 1, understand the business. Number 2, understand preparation for production. Number 3, understand production. Number 4, engage the market. All 4 of those stages are also very relevant and applicable to tendering. Understand tendering. Prepare well. That's planning for production. Compile your tender in a compliant manner. That is production. Engage the organ of state post the award of the tender, even if the tender did not come your way. Engage the organ of state for learning. Why? Because you need to learn as to where you went wrong within the overall process. That is the biggest learning as far as I'm concerned. Where did we go wrong? So going forward, what we say is that bidders need to start focusing more on the tender process as opposed to on the tender document. Why are we saying that? 99% of us who gets involved with tenders believe that the whole of the tender process is encapsulated or found within the tender document. In our longer workshops, we spend at least 2 hours on the given challenges, on the given disqualifiers that's found in the tender process, but not necessarily alerted within the tender document itself. So what are we saying? If you believe and your philosophy or your culture is as such that you will ring fence your response with regards to what's in the tender document, we say you are tendering in the blind. And for that, as an answer, we say, shift your focus to the process. Because when I ask you to bake me a chocolate cake, the first thing that you're going to say to me is, Gerrit, here's the list of ingredients. Think tendering, the list of the rules of engagement. Because a process, whether it's baking a chocolate cake or compiling a tender, the process demands a step-by-step approach. So now, 2 weeks before my birthday, I've asked you to bake me the chocolate cake. I arrive with the ingredients. And I say to you, I've changed my mind. I want you to show me how to bake this chocolate cake. Then what happens? You say, wait a minute, I'm going to fetch my recipe book. And within that recipe book, you will show me how do you, step by step, then bake a champion chocolate cake. Think tendering. Same process apply. I need to upskill my knowledge around the process because Herod said that not all the rules of engagement, the demands of tender process are found within the tender document per se. And for that reason, when we talk about the ingredients or we talk about the rules of engagement, we need to start with the conversation that's driven by Section 217 of the Constitution. It is very important from a wide variety of angles as to why, as a bidder or a person entering into the tendering domain, must understand the relevance and the nuanced demands of Section 217 of the Constitution. So the Constitutional Court is in the news quite a bit this week. And that is the beauty about what our lower courts then rules upon an issue, and the Constitutional Court then will further interpret as to whether the lower court, the Supreme Court of Appeal, the High Court before that, has then correctly applied the law. Now, when we say there's a prescript in law, it is actually an instruction. And in tendering, we also find in Chapter 13, Section 217 of the Constitution, such a prescript or an instruction to organs of state. So whether it's a municipality as an organ of state, whether it's a provincial government, whether it's a national department, a ministry, parliament, a state-owned enterprise like Transnet or ESCOM, or a state agency or state council, a museum, or anything that's found on the list of organs of state, then they must, at every single time when they want to procure goods and services, they must manage that whole process according to the Constitution, in accordance with a system which is ultimately fair. Fair in this context means that the state must give every person the opportunity to submit a bid if he or she feels confident that they can provide the goods or the services required. Also, one needs to bear in mind that despite the fact that there are many laws, whether it's applicable to health, education, safety and security, tendering, whatever the case may be, the law are never written to be too rigid. A law can't exist if it doesn't make for allowances. So essentially, as an example, when we say the Constitution says that the tendering process must be fair, open to everybody, there could be allowances where you can say, because of the nature of the project, we only want these accredited or these qualified companies to tender for this specific contract. And those who are still growing small and who are emerging companies, their time will come. But for now, this is a type of project or a contract where we need 20 years of experience, and the state can make that as a fair criteria to enter the game for potential bidders. Then the Constitution goes further by way of prescript or instruction by saying that every potential bidder must be treated equitably. So all bidders must receive the notice of the opportunity to tender at the same time. You can't, and it is unethical if you give Herod notice a week before and you also pass on the specifications to him, and he can prepare him a week in advance before everybody else sees the tender, as an example. Everybody needs to be treated equitably. You can't ask Herod to come and do a presentation to motivate his tender, whereas everybody else is not afforded that allowance. That will be not equitable in terms of the spirit and the DNA of Section 217. Further, Section 217 demands and instructs that all tenders must be open, transparent. And in this way, what we're saying here by way of interpretation is that the whole of the system as a process must be visible, pre, during and post the award of a tender. It must be visible. What does it say by way of interpretation? Is that all bidders should stand at the window and look through it and see what transpires with regards to the process. And each and every bidder, even society, civil society, has got right of access to a record of a decision that was taken to award the tender to ABC Enterprises, for example. Essentially, there are different laws that supports that right other than your constitutional right here in section 217. Then further, the Constitution demands that all tender processes must be competitive. So if we have to ask ourselves, what is the minimum interpretation of competitiveness? We would then conclude that there has to be at least a A competitor and a B competitor. That will be the minimum compliance in terms of section 217 when we talk about it must be competitive at all times. However, as I've mentioned, the law can never be too rigid not to allow for exceptions. And there will be exceptions where there will be no competition. For example, an emergency or where Gerrit is the only person who's got this product or service or software that is demanded in the country, and then he will become the single source of supply or the sole supplier, which means to say there's no need for the organ of state to go out on tender. Now we hear of people getting more contracts from government, and then we say to ourselves, but you never saw the tender being advertised. And then the first thing that we need to ask ourselves, perhaps there was deviation that is allowed on the different pieces of legislation to the demand of competitiveness. It's not always feasible that there will be competition in the marketplace. Then, finally, the Constitution then demands that all tender processes must be cost effective. And here I want to alert those who want to go into tendering. When it says cost effectiveness as a demand, price does not determine whether the process was cost effective. Price is a component of a budget that manages the specific tender process to procure goods and services, for example, software. There is a budget for the process, and price is part or a component of that budget allocated to the process to procure a software system for our department. So, if we say that price is a component, we immediately need to ask ourselves, are there any other components? And the answer would be yes, because there could be, again, some form of occurrence that nobody has foreseen. And whilst installing the software, lightning strikes, and we need to repair certain modems or certain parts of the IT network, which was not foreseen, and then there within the budget would be a component that we can tap into and say, let's then repair the damages before we continue with installing the software. Just a nonsense example, but it illustrates the point for that matter. Price is not budget. Do not let yourself to believe that your low price will win you the tender automatically. Low prices are the biggest factor for determining as to who scores the highest points out of 100 with regards to price. But price alone does not win you a tender, because the system in South Africa is designed around preferential procurement, giving preference to those people who were previously unfairly treated through disadvantage, a political system for that matter. So always bear in mind, yes, price is the biggest determining factor, but price is not the only factor in determining who wins the tender. So if we use section 217 of the Constitution as our departing point, we would then need to say, but surely there must be other supporting pieces of legislation. Yes, there are at least 60 other different pieces of legislation supporting the tender process. But from where you sit as a bidder or somebody that wants to enter the game of tendering, the following four on the slide are of primary concern. Tenders are primarily awarded based on the prescript or the instructions found in the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act of the year 2000. It is within this act that government in Regulation 2 is instructed to develop 2-point systems, a 90-10 point system for all tenders currently above 50 million rand. 90 points of the equation will be awarded to the person submitting the lowest price. 10 points will be submitted to the person with the highest BEE level, for example, level 1. That is the first point system demanded by this piece of legislation. The second point system is the 80-20 point system. For those tenders where the projected value will be below 50 million rand for that matter. And then, as before, 80 points, the greater part, will then be afforded to the person submitting the lowest price, and 20 points, the highest points allocation for the person with the best BEE status for that matter. In this case, would be a level 1 BEE contributor status level. So that is the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act that essentially governs as to which bidder should be awarded the tender. Well, there are exceptions within this act as well, especially with regards to Section 2(1)(f) of this particular act that says a person who did not score the highest out of the combination out of 100 of the 2-point systems may be awarded a tender on condition that the person scored better in the goals of the RDP, the Reconstruction Development Program, or in terms of redressing the imbalances of the past, if that was a goal that was included in the tender. But more detail about that in our longer workshops. Then, thirdly, the Public Finance Management Act is an act that governs the process of buying goods and services through a tendering process by an organ of state. We call them PFMA entities. A PFMA entity, like a provincial department, like a provincial legislature, like a national parliament, like a national department, a state-owned enterprise, a state council, or a state agency, they are obliged, or the majority of them are obliged, to comply with the Public Finance Management Act. The Act prescribes to the officials in these organs of state as to how they must manage the tender process in a fair, transparent, and equitable manner. Now, for local government, we have a similar law called the Municipal Finance Management Act that also then prescribes as to how the tendering process must unfold at a local government level. So a local government organ of state could be a municipality, a local water board, a local transport authority, etc., etc. Then, lastly, as a key supporting piece of legislation that concerns us at this point in time is the BE Act of 2003. Now, the BE Act was followed then by the BE codes. So we have sectoral codes for ICT, for media, for attorneys. There's a draft one on the table for construction, for tourism, for forestry, and the like. So there's at least about 11 similar or sectoral BE codes that then governs those sectors. For the rest, it is the generic codes that would be applicable. The confluence or the marriage between the BE Act and the triple PFA on top is when you submit a tender, if you want to claim points, either out of the 10, if applicable today, or out of the 20 applicable tomorrow in another tender, if you want to claim those points, proportionally speaking, related to your BE status, level 1 or level 2 as an example, you must then submit your BE certificate if you're a generic company, or your affidavit if you're a smaller company, an exempted micro enterprise EME, or a qualifying small enterprise QSE are required to submit affidavit only. Now, it is very important to understand that when you collect a tender and the tender stipulates that you must submit a BE certificate, then that certificate or that bid document, apologies, essentially stipulated that only people with a certain BE level or a status or carrying a status of EME or QSE may tender. That is the only instance where an organ of state through a tender can demand that you submit a BE certificate or an affidavit. However, for all other tenders, very important to note, where there is no such demand of a minimum BE status or to be an EME or a QSE, if you don't have a BE certificate, you can't be disqualified from the tender. It's a prescript in law that you are not obliged to have a BE certificate. For example, that when the tender closes, your existing BE certificate, so to say, has expired and you're waiting on a new one to arrive. So at closing time of the tender at 11 o'clock on Friday, the 2nd of July, you do not have a certificate or any document to prove your status, then you can't be disqualified in all other tenders where there is no demand to submit your BE status for that matter. So essentially, if we look at all the different pieces of legislation, we can make a synopsis of them and place them in a step-by-step process of a quadrant, right? So in the first quadrant, so keep this quadrant in your mind's eye, because we're now going to proceed from block number 1 or quad 1, 2, 3, and 4 for that matter. And then what we're going to do is we're going to then break up all that pieces of legislation into a simpler process of understanding for ourselves wanting to enter the game of tendering. So in the first box, that legislation that we just saw now dictates that there must be a stage 1 in tendering. So again, if you look at the heading, it talks about the tendering process and not the tendering document. So in this stage, as demanded by that piece of legislation, there must be a specifications committee. All committees, there are 3 committees in tendering, are appointed by the accounting officer of the relevant organ of state. Now, in this stage, the end user, we are buying a X-ray machine for the clinic, and the clinic, the head of the radiology department, then says to us that this is my requirement, I need a new X-ray machine. Here are the makeup and the specifications of that machine that we like. They can't mention the name. If it's impractical and you can't avoid mentioning a brand, then you must ask for similar or equivalent. It is against the law to just say, I want ABC brand, because that's what we work with. Okay, the market must be given a fair chance to respond through competition. Then the specifications committee signs off on the specifications for that requirement, which is the X-ray machine. Everybody's happy up until this stage, and now the supply chain management unit, there's a little unit of officials within the organ of state then that designs the tender with the specifications as well as the instructions. Now, we said earlier on, in order to submit a compliant bid, we need to fully comply with the directives of the instructions in the tender. My great response to the specifications, my super product offer in terms of my own X-ray machine counts for nothing if I don't comply with the instructions of tender. So what are we saying, people? It is not my best price that necessarily will win me the tender. It is not my best or super product makeup that will necessarily win the tender. I still need to comply, submit a compliant bid, and only then will my super product and my best price come up for consideration. So please eradicate that thing from your mind that it is all about price, it is all about the best product. It does not work like that because legislation dictates otherwise. Going forward to stage 2 in the quadrant. Block number 2 in the quadrant. It's all about you, the person responding to the bid or now going to submit a proposal for this tender. Essentially, your challenge is to collect the most updated tender, because tender details change before it closes, and you need to make sure that when you submit your bid on the 2nd of July at 11 o'clock, that your bid is the most updated bid. Then you need to strictly follow the rules of compilation, because sometimes a tender can stipulate this is a two-envelope tender process, whereas you must put all the technical documents in envelope number 1 and all the financial documents in envelope number 2. If you do mix them up, your bid, irrespective if it carries the best price, the better product of everybody, your bid will be disqualified. What are we saying? Follow the instructions as you go along and be fully compliant with bid compilation. There's always instructions as to how you submit, where and at what time you must submit the bid. Don't be late, and don't argue that if it says 1100, 11H00, then don't argue to say that it's 11 o'clock before midnight tonight. 1100 clearly stipulates it's 11 o'clock in the morning before noon. So be specific and don't make up your own rules as you go along. Interpret according to what's in front of you. Don't confuse yourselves with the terminology. I get this all the time, and it pretty much upset me when people read instructions incorrectly. But the word in front of them means something totally different, and they go do the opposite. Then, essentially, as a bidder, responding to this tender, you have 3 key challenges or 3 key hurdles which you need to cross. Firstly, ensure that your bid stays valid. Many people call me up and ask me, so what are the returnables as a segment to determine whether your bid is valid or not? The returnables, I always say, make it easy on yourself. When you see that word in the tender, you'll see it in a tender document. When you see that word, just remember, return the tender document as you found it. Do not take things out of the document and attach those documents that did not come with the tender document, which is now required. In fact, City of Cape Town used to say, I'm not sure if they still do it, I haven't seen a bid document of them for a while, they would say that do not dismember this tender document, meaning to say do not take it apart to make photocopies or give each of your team members a section within the tender. Your bid, when you return it, will be disqualified or be declared invalid for that matter. To make sure that your bid stays qualified, a tender also demands lots of information. So if the tender demands that you must provide public liability insurance of 1 million rand for this construction tender, then essentially, if you submit them a certificate of 500,000, then your bid is not qualified, as an example. So essentially, to make it easy for yourself, when you cross this challenge of bid qualification, then ask yourself, have we provided all the required or requested information to this tender? If you leave out anything, your bid will be declared as not qualified. Then lastly, the biggest hurdle of them all, which we're going to unpack later on in another slide, is you need to make sure that your bid is responsive. When you submit a tender and you get a letter of rejection, it will always stipulate something to the following effect. Dear Sir, Madam, we thank you for submitting the tender for procuring the software for our department, but your bid was declared as non-responsive. And there's a criteria that we will unpack later on as mentioned. Then, everybody now, potential bidders, they submit their tender, the department or the organ of state receives it, and then the supply chain management unit does a pre-evaluation assessment. They're looking only for technical compliance. Have you compiled the tender, or are your response in line with the demands or the checklist that was with the tender? Whether there's a checklist or not with the tender, create, the best advice you can ever get is to create your own checklist of instructions. And once you've compiled your bid, then you can tick off your own checklist, add it to their checklist, but do not just follow their checklist. create your own checklist, because I've said earlier on, not all the rules of the game are contained within the tender document. Now, 100 bids were submitted, and then out of that 100 bids, only 30 of them were technically compliant. And that 30 technically compliant bids then graduates to the third stage in the quadrant. It's called bid evaluation stage. Remember, the first box of the quadrant was bid specification stage. Second box of the quadrant was bidders response and compilation. Stage 3 now is bid evaluation stage. Another committee comes to the fore in the form of the bid evaluation committee, also appointed by the accounting officer of the organ of state. The tender document would have indicated upfront which evaluation methodology would be followed by this committee when they score your offer. When they say it's apples versus apples, it's just simply they were procuring laptops. And now they compare Gerrit's laptop offer versus that of Winnie Kumalo's laptop offer. Apples versus apples. But when the tender upfront indicates or dictates that functionality as a methodology will be applicable, then it is a point system, not related to the 90-10 or the 80-20, a different point system that will score your tender, and inclusive of your technical understanding, your track record, your financial offer, your professional team that you're going to include on the contract, and the like. So they score you based on that information that you provide them with under the methodology of functionality. So this all transpires within the bid evaluation stage. This committee then does the scoring according to sheets that were provided to them that contains maximum scores, which they now have to allocate a score for you, and then they then create a short list. And that shortlist graduates to the last stage in the tendering process, bid adjudication. Now remember, the accounting officer appoints different committees for different stages of the internal tender process, not the process where you were involved with in block number 2. In block number 1, block number 3, and block number 4, it's all transpiring internally. And the organ of state is then accordingly by law, by way of instruction, appoints these committees. So, here in the last and most important stage, she also appointed a bid adjudication committee. The bid adjudication committee considers the report that was given by the previous committee, the BEC. And this committee are all powerful because they can accept the recommendation as to who must be recommended for the tender. They can reject an award or recommend a different party or a different bidder for that matter, or they can send the report back for review to the previous committee. But let's assume that they are quite happy with the report, and then they recommend the report to the accounting officer. The accounting officer then, after conducting a due diligence on the preferred or recommended bidder, will then go into contract with that company. And then you'll notice that none of these committee members or the committees itself, or themselves rather, did not have any power to appoint a bidder, the recommended or the preferred bidder. That power only rests with the accounting officer. So, in a nutshell, if you say, explain the process of tendering to me in a short bit, that is what we've just done now. We looked at the quadrant and we say all the pieces of legislation that sits out there, there's almost 60 of them as I've mentioned. We've now brought them into the equation in 4 different blocks. So ask any question pertaining to tendering. We will go to any one of these 4 blocks for an answer. Because what we will do is we will look for legal reference. If you look at stage 4 where we are now, what are the authorities of the accounting officer? There's legal reference to that question. Then, that is the overall process that transpires within tendering. And then, the tendering process in South Africa in relation to government tendering has got 2 types of bidding processes. One is an open bid process where all and sundry may enter bids. However, on a different day, the tender would stipulate, or may stipulate rather, that only those who are graded GB9 for the CIDB grading, Construction Industry Development Board grading, may tender. And then those who are graded as a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 general building under the CIDB grading may not tender. It's called pre-qualification. Or under Regulation 4.1 of the Triple PFA regulations, which currently allows for pre-qualifying criteria, it's an open bid, but the organ of state said only EME and QSEs may tender. Despite the fact that the regulations are currently at the Constitutional Court for consideration as to whether it's legal or not. We're awaiting the judgment. Then there are closed bidding processes as well. So many people are under the incorrect belief that when it states it's a closed tender, they would say that all that will happen is that the organ of state won't open the tender. That is incorrect. A closed tender starts off with an open process, request for proposals, for example. 100 people responded, and then the organ of state then choose 7 of the best bidders and place them on a roster or a panel. Going forward, for example, needing legal services, the organ of state will only go to those attorneys on the panel and either ask them to compete against each other for this specific contract or do it on a rotational basis. So that is the two kind of bidding processes that we find within government tendering in South Africa. Then we have 2 types of bidding activities. And the bidding activities are primarily governed by rand value. So remember, we have 2 levels of government. Let's start with local government. A request for quotation at local government, as we speak, it is to be changed in the near future. The rand values are currently 200,000 rand inclusive of taxes. So whenever local government issue a request for quotation, the value can't exceed 200,000 rand inclusive of taxes. The reverse will be true if it's a tender at local government level. That value would be above 200,000, and that value is not related to the 80-20 below 50 million or the 1910 above 50 million equations. It is not related. It's irrespective thereof. Now, on PFMA entity level, remember we said anything above local government would be considered as an organ of state, which we now call a PFMA entity for that matter, and on local government we call it an MFMA entity. Now, all PFMA entities, as we speak, up until 1st of August, their values, as we speak, for a request for quotation is 500,000 and below. That value changes to 1 million rand on the 1st of August. It was supposed to come into effect today, but Treasury gave another month leeway for organs of state to get the documents in order, because from then onwards it will be 1 million rand for RFQs at the PFMA level, which means to say the reverse is also true. A tender would then be in excess of 1 million rand. There are different requirements for tenders and requests for quotations from an organ of state point of view. A request for quotation, standardly speaking, only demands 3 written responses, whereas a tender would demand, according to Section 217, if you remember, it will demand a minimum of 2 competing bids. And that is one of the big differences also between tenders and requests for quotations. Other than the values, that would be the other big consideration. Now, in terms of our statement earlier on that the most important part of the tender process is in block number 2 of the quadrant that pertains to your process of compiling the bid. So once again, we say that the standard tender forms are that important for consideration. So when you tender on a local government level, you see on the forms on the right-hand top corner, it will stipulate municipal bid document number 1, number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and it will be called MBD. Then, if you tender for an organ or state above local government, it will be called standard bid document number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. What am I saying to you? That standard tender forms are 9 in number. There's a maximum of 9 standard bidding forms that may be included in a tender. A maximum. It could be less for reason unbeknown to ourselves at that stage. However, it is very important that we have a full understanding of these 9 tender forms. So bid document number 1 would be the invitation to bid. It will then contain details such as the closing date, the tender number, the tender description, as well as the closing date, I'm sure I've mentioned that, as well as the location and the box number as to where you must deliver the tender. It will also ask you about your tax compliance, your registration on the Central Supplier Database, which is compulsory. It will also then ask you about your BE status, whether you are a generic company or an EME or QSE, and what type of document do you have. Do you have a certificate or do you have a affidavit for that matter? And then further on, it will just then give you an explanation of the conditions of tender, as well as your compliances for tax and the CSD for that matter. And it is also this form that would demand at the end on page 2 that would ask you to provide proof of appointment or authority as to who may sign this bid. And that could be a resolution of the board, or it could also be a letter of appointment appointing Gerrit to sign this tender on our behalf. So the bid documents, before I proceed, is the same irrespective of where you tender local government or provincial or national government or state-owned enterprises. The bid documents are the same in nature. Then we don't have a bid document number 2 anymore, because it is now being replaced by the PIN. Your SARS PIN number would be used to check your compliance. So there's no need to use bid document number 2 anymore. Bid document number 3 comes in 3 different instances, or are applicable in 3 different instances. If you notice, there's a 3.1 SBD or MBD 3.1 document, then that document will only demand firm pricing for purchasing of goods and works. Firm pricing, meaning to say that your price can't change for the duration of the contract. However, there are regulatory instances where your price will change, over which you have no control over, like VAT, customs tariffs, sectoral determination, labor rates have changed for wages, as well as there's an extraordinary occurrence in the marketplace where the price of steel rocketed by 20%. You can then also ask for price deviation or price increase, despite the fact that the form says the prices must be firm. Then on another day, let's just say you're involved in manufacturing, engineering, or construction, then SBD or MBD 3.2 form will be applicable. And this is for pricing that is not firm, meaning to say that in section A of this form, you will be allowed to do contract price adjustments for the duration of the contract, right? There's a formula that you would work out that is determined by different indices like fuel, transport, labor, CPIX. Those are all indices that fluctuate, and then your price can also then fluctuate accordingly. So that is found in section A of MBD 3.2. In MBD 3.3, is applicable to all bids that calls for services, professional services in nature. And that form is then applicable to those people who do accounting, auditing, advisory services, cleaning, IT, and the like. That is for professional services. Moving on, the most important form is the declaration of interest in every tender or request for quotation for that matter. It is a must, it is obligatory that it must be completed by the bidder, and this form primarily asks you about your details as the person who's completing the bid. It asks you about whether the person or any persons involved with the company are also employed by the state, which primarily is illegal as we speak, and we're not sure as to why that question is still in this bid document number 4. And then further on, it will ask you also the question as to what business did you receive from the state over the last 12 months. You need to list that if it's applicable. And then it will also ask you whether you know anybody that works within this organ or state who issued the tender, as to whether they'll be involved with the bid evaluation, think block number 3, or bid adjudication, think block number 4. And you can only appropriately answer that relevant to the circumstances. Then it will even ask you as to whether you know whether any of your competitors know anybody that works with the organ of state or in the organ of state that may be involved with the evaluation of the bid. And then further on, it will ask you whether you have sister companies or related companies. Irrespective of whether they tender for this tender or not, you must list them. And then paragraph 3 of this MBD4 would then ask you to list all the directors, the ID numbers, and the tax numbers for that matter. MBD5, there are 2 types of MBD5s. If you tender for PFMA entities and you will be importing a component or products that are in excess of $10 million, then you would need to complete SBD5 for that level. However, on local government level, the SBD5 are applicable to all tenders that are above 10 million rand. And if that is the case of such a tender value, then you as the bidder must then provide your financials, your audited financials, or your management accounts if it's a new company. SBD6 or MBD6 sits at the heart of the award of tenders. This is where they will state to you as to which point system is applicable in the tender. You'll see it on page 1 of SBD 6.1. So it will either state 90-10 or 80-20 for that matter. Then you need to price accordingly. As you would know, 80-20, your pricing must be below 50 million. 90-10, your pricing can't be below 50 million. It must be above 50 million. And it is in this section 6 of this SBD 6.1 or MBD 6.1 that you would also list your status. Let's assume you're a level 1 BE company, and the points that you claim. You insert the points because there's a table above section 6 of this form that indicates your status as well as the points that you claim, subject to it being an 80-20 or a 90-10 point system for that matter. And then further on, declaration of local production and content certificate is then applicable in SBD or MBD 6.2. Now, there is an extensive list of about 28 sectors of products that's been designated for local content. For example, clothing, textiles, and leather. If the organ of state wants to procure a garment for ESCOM workers, then that garment must be produced 100% locally. If you can't and you need to import the zip, the buttons, and the lining for that garment, then you must apply for authorization for a percentage of import. Maybe it's 10%, then you apply for 10% imports to Treasury to authorize you to use it within manufacturing this garment. So there are a list of products, and each product that are listed has got a percentage target. So office furniture or even school furniture, I'm not sure now, it will say 80%. Or let's talk buses. An organ of state wants to buy a bus, and the target for local production and content is 80% for that bus, which means to say you're allowed to import 20%. However, without reporting the 20%. However, if you need to import an additional 10% of the 80%, then you need to apply for an exemption. So there's a distinction for all products on the list, other than clothing, textiles, leather, and footwear. You apply for an exemption, and for clothing and the like, you apply for authorization. So further to this form, there are 3 other declarations. A declaration C, D, and E, which you must complete to show the values of your import on Annexa D, shows you the values of your imports, and Annexa E shows you the values of your local production, and you amalgamate all the values of D and E, and then you insert it on Annexa C. We do a 3-hour workshop just on how to complete these forms correctly. Then MBD or SBD 7 is then the contract form. So on page 2 of SBD 1 on top, they would advise you that the successful bidder will be required to complete SBD 7 or MBD 7. 7.1 is where you won the tender and the organ of state is doing a purchase. 7.2 is where you won the tender and the organ of state is purchasing a service. 7.3 is where you bought successfully land or redundant equipment from the organ of state, where you become the buyer and the state becomes the seller. SBD 8, as it says, give us a reflection of your past supply chain or tendering practices for that matter. There's about 5 questions if I recall correctly. And if any one of them, the answer is yes, then you're wasting your time because you will not be considered for award of tender. Bear in mind what Gerrit says. SBD 8, all the answers must be no, then you are at ease within your heart that you will be considered. If any answer is yes, you are wasting your time and your money for that matter. SBD 9 or MBD 9 for that matter is a declaration by yourself that you have not met with your competitors to discuss this specific tender for whatsoever reason. Whether it is to agree that Gerrit is going to submit a non-compliant bid and Simon is going to submit a compliant bid, that is collusion and it's now criminal in nature, no longer a common law offense. So that is the standard bidding forms that you'll find in a bid document. Bearing in mind that the document will consist of other parts as well. Tender data, primarily the specifications or the scope of works for construction will be contained therein. There will be schedules, there will be drawings, there will be other documents, for example, the general conditions of contracts and the like. Those things are all as segments makes up the concept of a bid document at the end of the day. But our primary focus is on full compliance with the tender documents. The attitude of leaving things out and say to your colleague that they won't worry about that must go out by the door. Full compliance or don't tender, don't waste your time and your money, if I may be as brutal as that. Then, with the demand of subcontracting within tenders through Regulation 4.1c of the current triple PFA regulations, it has thus become a big issue of conversation within the procurement environment. But safe to say, there are 3 different types of subcontractors, which some of you might know, and for the rest who are new to tendering, when the organ of state talks about list or name your domestic subcontractors, then we know it is the people that we will appoint out of our own free will. Nobody is demanding that we must subcontract, but if the nature of our business is as such that we subcontract, list the domestic subcontractor. Then on another day is where the organ of state provides you with a construction contract, and then when you go to site, you will find that there are subcontractors already on site, and those are what we call nominated subcontractors. They have already been aligned for work prior to you arriving on site in a construction tender, for example. Then we have selected subcontractors is now with the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act regulations, when they demand that you must subcontract, for example, a minimum of 30%, then you then need to source the selected subcontractor from the central supplier database. Going forward, now we talk about the 3 steps that we mentioned in block number 2. What makes your bid valid, what makes your bid qualified, and what makes your bid responsive. So making your bid responsive for adjudication, let's start with the last one first because it's the most important. When your bid is being declared as responsive, you then have complied, you've showed within your tender document that you've complied with the terms and conditions of tender, not of contract. You've complied with the terms and conditions on how to tender, which was in the form of instructions from the organ of state, not the terms and conditions of contract. That is something separate within tendering. Also, You have showed them that you've duly signed all the necessary forms, as well as having initialed every single page of the tender. In law, it is contractually demanded that you initial every single page. Why? Because you're making an offer. The information on a page must be affirmed by the person having the authority to sign the tender, and that comes through by initialing every single page. Then, further to test whether your bid is responsive, the organ of state must look at the compliance of the requirement. Are you supplying them with an X-ray machine and not a scanner, and that your X-ray machine then further complies with the desired or requested specifications or scope of works when it's construction? Then lastly, the test for responsiveness is to assess whether you have submitted the tender document by way of instruction. As we've mentioned, the tender might stipulate this is a 2-envelope system. Then you need to design your response of compilation according to the instruction. Technical documents in envelope number 1 as an example, and financial offer in envelope number 2 by way of example. Then let's go to the other 2 criteria for making your bid qualified and valid. The first thing for bid validity is they'll check if you have signed SBD 7. SBD 7 that we've just covered now is the form of contract and the form of offer. If it is in the tender like City of Cape Town would do and a few others, then you must sign that form at the bottom. You must at the bottom also insert the name of the bidder, and also they'll check whether your pricing schedule, remember, SBD 3.1, 3.2 or 3.3, whichever one is applicable in the tender, they will now check and verify whether you have signed that pricing schedule. If you have not signed your pricing schedule, your bid will be disqualified. Then lastly, as we've mentioned, you need to make sure that your bid remains qualified. The example that I've given about the public liability insurance, if they ask for 5 million certificate, you should not give them a 2 million or a 1 million rand certificate for that matter. Your bid will be declared as not qualified. Essentially, that would be a broad overview of the tendering process and where you as a bidder fit into. The one thing that is critical, if you want to enter into the arena of tendering, do know what is required from yourself, and more importantly, get to know what's required from the organ of state. I thank you.